presentation.
Thank you very much. Shalom lekulam. Marhaba lil-jamia. Ciao a tutti. So it's good, very good to be here again. It's a little bit like home, but I'm very grateful that we have an opportunity to discuss it. It's a very hard time. We're living through a disaster in our homeland. So it's good to take a step back and trying to analyze it. Manal did a very good job about the mixed cities, which of course are very much the rarity in Israel-Palestine. And I will also touch on that. And I'd like to try and get the spatial, geographical planning foundations of the conflict to see how we can understand the Gaza, not as a one event that is happening at the moment, but as part of a sequence, part of a history, a political geography of a very troubled place. And perhaps a good place to start is that picture. About 2 years ago, I went to Bab el-Amud, which is part of the Old Jerusalem. I think in English it's called the Damascus Gate or the Jaffa Gate, the Damascus Gate. And inside there is souvenirs. I always buy souvenirs to bring to my friends in Italy, etc. And I saw these two magnets, identical. One of them say Israel and the other one saying Palestine. And you look behind it, they're made in China, right? So, but what it shows is the imagination, the spatial imagination, the attachment, the bondage of the two people to the same piece of land. And you can even be more ironic than that and say that this piece of land that is sacred to people, that they are willing to die for, willing to kill for, is actually a colonial creature. It never existed in history before the British and the French decided to divide the Middle East. There was a land of Israel, there was Palestine. It's not identical to that. But now it became what we call a geobody. It became a symbol, it became a myth, and it's identical. And this is quite rare around the world. The two people feel the same homeland is theirs, and they're fighting over it. Of course, it's not totally rare, like Northern Ireland, like South Africa, like Bolivia, like there are places around the world. I think this is very, very important. And this is A.B. Yoshua, one of the famous authors of Israel, said recently, the deep reason why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so protracted is the overlapping visions of the homeland by both people. This will not go away. So we have to deal with that. And this is where planning and spatial imagination come into being. Okay, I have the same problem as Manal. The arrow is not working.
Click on the slide, next slide.
Sorry?
There's a slide, so you click on the next slide.
Here?
Yeah. One more.
Okay. So a preliminary comment is with this geography, overlapping geography, there's some things that have to be said. Normally, they don't have to be said in Europe, etc. But we do have to say that my perspective goes along with international law. That means the existence of Israel and Palestine is a must. The prohibition of conquest, prohibition of colonialism, prohibition of terror and killing of civilians, all this is a foundation, is not taken for granted now with the disaster that we see. Self-determination and human rights and protection of minorities. And the October 7 exposed how fragile, and I know we have here a Center for Fragility, but how fragile these kind of assumptions are that we used to take for granted. Just some of the imagery. Israel, much more powerful than Palestine. It has adopted this kind of imagery. All the official maps in Israel, everywhere you go in the universities, in the schools, in the government, like Netanyahu, is there looking at us with his smile. Is the whole land, Palestine and Israel, is called Israel on the maps. Very famously, a few weeks before October 7, he raised in the UN the future of the Middle East, and he showed Israel without Palestine. Right? But also, ironically, a little bit like Afula, in what the government chooses to see the poster of Israel, right? The most important iconic image, there is Masjid al-Aqsa, right? There's Palestine inside Israel, even in what Israel chooses to show. It just shows how intertwined the two nations are. both part of the Palestinian leadership, Hamas and Fatah, use the icon of the same land. You see in top Abu Mazen, Marwan Barghouti, the land. And with Hamas, it's pushed a little bit to the side because Hamas is Islamic and also nationalist. So they have the mosque and also the same image. So you see how deep the spatial attachment imaginations are. Now, with that kind of conflict over 100 years, come the October 7th disaster. Manal already did some work for me in describing how terrible it was and continues to be. This is why I call it October 7 war. October 7 and October 8 perhaps was disaster for the Jews, but since then all the violence moved to Gaza and also a little bit to Lebanon. Just some images from this disaster, and all the horrific numbers are there. You've seen that, you've heard about it, the people abducted, the nearly 1,200 people murdered, so many injured, 600 rockets were flying in one day, mostly to the south of Israel, many people killed from those rockets as well. This is the worst massacre day in the conflict of 100 years. And it's the second worst day of terrorism in the history of the world, or the modern world, after 9/11. So just see the magnitude of it and how shocking it was. And this, the land that was captured by Hamas is there for a day or so, then they retreated. And then, of course, the war afterwards is the worst act of violence Israel against the Palestinians in the 100 years history. Unprecedented violence, total destruction, revenge. You see the map there that we geographers are very good at mapping the destruction of Gaza, what we call herbicide or domicide. Gaza itself is the largest Palestinian city. The largest Palestinian city is 70% in ruins, a bit like Dresden, even some people say worse than Dresden, but also Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah and thankfully Rafah not yet. But you see that even Rafah here has suffered quite a lot of bombing. And then there is the refugees that are concentrating there. And then also in the north of Israel, it has to be said, some of my family, I mean, I know a lot of people that are very involved and people that are killed, but my family that comes from the north is all evacuated. So for 4 months, there's about 60 to 70,000 Israelis evacuated from the Hezbollah bombing and about 100,000 Lebanese that have moved north just to take the spatial dimension of it. The West Bank too is in flames. There's already 250 Palestinians killed, about 6 Israelis killed in the West Bank during this because the settlers, the Jewish settlers, have feeling free to attack many Palestinians, and this is part of the aspect of this war. Okay, so having said that, let's try and peel it back and see what's actually happening on a more structural or historical level. So we start with conceptual or theoretical planning, urban theory. About 30 years ago, I wrote an article that was echoed around the world about the dark side of planning. And we are in a discipline, planners, architects, geographers, we very much like to look at the light side, how things can be better, and it's very important. But nonetheless, phenomena in the world have other sides to it. And there's not enough theorization of the dark side, the way planning tools, spatial tools, development tools, land policies can be used as oppression, as colonization, as creating fragility and displacement. So this is very important. And also part of that package is the resistance. We don't theorize enough the resistance to colonization, the resistance to oppression, which can have many ways. And I'd like to finish by showing some hope that comes from anti-colonial or decolonization, democratic resistance, not terror, which is disastrous in itself and creates more and more violence and oppression, but other types of resistances. And I put there that a new cut is needed. I've written an article about 5 years ago about the need for a new cut, which is critical urban theory that looks at all these gamut and possibilities. My approach is pluriversal. There's not one force that is happening. There's various structural forces. Some people call it intersectionality. And we have to open up those boxes. We open up this oppression and see what's happening in order to combat it. The key point that in Israel-Palestine, the disaster that we see is very, very much related to planning, very, very much related to space and to settlement, to land and to segregation. You already heard about it. And also in the last 2 years, I'm studying the digitalization prospect, and that adds another layer of conflict and inequality. But all of those, it's important to say, have the potential to reverse. They have the potential to transform and make things better. So it's a site of struggle, if you like, but so far we have to be honest and to look at how planning has been used to colonize the land and create conflict after conflict for over 100 years. Some of my studies that you might have seen, I have a comparative analysis to people in Israel. If they compare anything, they love to compare themselves to Holland or France or the United States. But I think the right comparison is to Sri Lanka or Northern Ireland or Pakistan or Chechnya. And these are states that have the same dynamics. And this is why I've recently, this year, I published a book about looking at planning theory from the global southeast. It's called Theorize. And this is where we can learn a lot, not from deliberative democracy that's happening in air-conditioned rooms in Oxford, but we have to look at Karachi or Colombo or Istanbul or places like it to see how to understand space and planning in Israel society, in Israel and Palestine. So we can learn a lot. We can learn a lot what to do and what not to do from some of these struggles, the Chechnya, the Kurds, the Tamils, the Kosovars, etc., etc. And then another important point is that civil society is very important, where states are involved quite often in state crime, when resistance quite often is, illegal or sometimes terrorist, etc., etc. Civil society becomes very, very important, and it makes a difference. And it has to be strengthened, of course, but it provides alternatives and hope to a situation that sometimes looks hopeless. And I like to show two examples at the end. Now, go here. No, I go here. These are recent publications. One of them I did a special issue of the journal City, where it's called "Throw Togetherness in Hostile Environments," with a colleague from Poland, Anna Gawlewicz. And I did a special issue of the Settler Colonial Journal with Libby Porter from Melbourne. And I think that's another very important angle, because Israel is a settler colonial state, and you can compare to some of the dynamics. Of course, it's not only settler colonial, it's also a country of refugees, it's also a national struggle, it's also capitalist, but it's very important to look at the knowledge that we have. And this is the book for looking from the Southeast, Theorized from the Southeast. So this is the end of the commercial part, yeah. Okay, now when we try to open up the black box of what is planning, we're in a school of planning. There's a few important elements. We won't have time to go all of them. You tell me 10 minutes before the end. Yeah. There is statutory planning, making outline plans, where Manal is an expert for the planning and building law, etc., etc. And it creates displaceability. When you don't find yourself in the plan, right? Suddenly you're threatened. That happens a lot in Israel. They can make a plan that does not include around Beersehba. Half the area of Beersehba is not included in the plan, you see, but it's already existing. So that's the statutory side. And then there's settlement, more active kind of planning. Settlement, land policy, segregation, digitalization, what I call gray spacing, and the resistance alternative. If we have time, we touch on what we can. But the Israeli planning system has two arms to it, if you like. One of them is statutory planning, just like any country in Europe. We make zoning plans. We have these committees that discuss them day and night. We have all kinds of logics of development, suburbanization, densities, transport, etc., etc. But then there is actual development, which doesn't correspond with the plans, because there's other arms of government and also non-government agencies that develop the land, quite often bypassing, totally shattering the outline plans. First and foremost is the ILA, which is the Israel Land Authority, which is actually made of Jewish representatives from around the world, because half the board members are representing the Jewish National Fund, which is a global Jewish organization. And then you have the military, very, very important. The Jewish agencies, the settler kibbutz and Amanah movement and the settler movement, etc., etc. So you have many arms that change space. They're sanctioned by the government quite often, but they're not part of the statutory planning. So this is very important to remember. It's a system that is quite sophisticated because the government says, "What do you want? We did this plan." But what this organization came through, sometimes they say it's not us. It's a Jewish National Fund. It's a Jewish agency. It's the settlers, etc., etc. So this is a complex system. I'd like to stress also that big part of the Jewish public is quite happy with the Israeli planning system. It's doing well. It's a secure housing, good standard of living, very high level of urbanism, services are provided, 60% home ownership, which is quite high, very expensive property values, and 96% of it, as Manal said, is in Jewish or state land ownership. They feel very secure with that system, but of course it's got the dark side that they don't see, they don't talk about it, they don't see, which is the Palestinian side. And I'd like to also show that Israel is a very strong economy, even though it's suffering this year. The GDP per capita is $42,000. I think it's higher than Italy. Higher than Italy, right? But Palestine is $4,000 per capita. Remember, two people on the same land, one is 10 times richer than the other. And in 1948, studies show they were about the same. Okay, the Palestinian population, 1947, and the Jewish populations were about the same level of economic development. Look at the gap now. Much of it is to do with planning policies. So the linchpin is settlement, the Judaization process, the colonization process. So I just want to show you some slides that people normally don't show. 1917, 100 years ago, when the British comes, 62 Jewish settlements, a minute minority of Jews, maybe I think 3% that were on the land, right? In 1947, before the state, there's already 332 Jewish settlements. They purchased land. These people, by the way, are mostly Jewish refugees. It has to be remembered. They're thrown out of Europe after the Holocaust, and some thrown out from the Arab world. And then in 1967, you already have 764 settlements, massive Jewish settlement project inside proper Israel. 1993, Israel already captured the occupied territories and already has 911 settlements, massive development, which is illegal by international law, over the borders, in Gaza as well, it's important. And in 2020, we already have nearly 1,200. Now, this year, we have more than 1,200 settlements. So just look at this incredible settlement, and a lot of it, all of it, is planning oriented. They're planners, graduates of us that sit down. Sorry? Driven, oriented, whatever you want to call it. But it is the taken for granted. In ethnocratic states, when I did my study in Sri Lanka or in Northern Ireland or in Estonia or in other places in Serbia, the taken for granted was that we tried to make this place Serbian, right? The east side of Bosnia or Kosovo, we try to make it. So Israeli planners are raised with a colonial framework. This is good to make Judaization. And they don't see the other side. But the other side is very important. I'll show you in a minute. The other side is Palestine in 1947 has 903 localities and 14 cities. It's the most developed part of the Arab world. Some Lebanese would argue against this, but I think it was the most developed part. Jaffa was a very cosmopolitan city, Haifa was, etc., etc. And now, after the Nakba, which is the War of Independence and the big disaster in Arabic, you had this area ethnically cleansed. That is, Palestinians were driven out of big part of the homeland. The green area is being ethnically cleansed, and you could see that 450 localities roughly were demolished, and 6 cities, Palestinian cities, were demolished. And more or less, without great difference, this has a geography that stayed until today. Okay, there are some small changes, but if you look structurally, it is the two nations are the same homeland, but the Palestinians were marginalized and became refugees. You see that they became refugees, and many refugees came to Gaza, and that's very important. Now also think about how it was created through the war. People went to Gaza not knowing they're going to be in a different country, right? Because it was the same country. And then after they became in Gaza, in refugee camp, Israel put the border in and didn't let people return. This is a huge part of the conflict. So this is really quite important. Now I skip and I go back to show that it's not only expansion, but Israel also retreated. And that's important in trying to understand the complex system. Israel retreated in 1982 from Sinai and demolished 16 Jewish settlements. In 1994 and 1995, it retreated from Area A and B in the West Bank with the Oslo Accord, which was some kind of an attempt to reconciliation. Then Rabin was assassinated, the prime minister, and since then there's no more retreat there. In 2000, Israel retreated from Lebanon. Importantly for us, 2005, Israel retreated from Gaza. It took its army from Gaza and demolished 17 settlements. This is the first time the settlements were demolished in the land of Israel. Remember, the sacred land, people treated it there because Sinai wasn't part of it. So this was very, very significant. And what's happening now in Israel-Palestine to many people on the right wing, on the apartheid side of Israel, they're just trying to correct what happened in 2005. How dare you have taken the Israelis out of Gaza? They want the Israelis back to Gaza. And it might still happen. This is quite important to get the geography. Now, what we have overall now is that the space, you see the white area is the Judaized space. It's a Judaized land control, and I've written a whole book about how land has been Judaized. It's an amazing legal system, amazing success. As someone standing in court and representing some Palestinians and Bedouins, I can see how incredibly powerful Israel has created a land system that there's nowhere to go. Even if you prove that your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents lived on that land, they said, but in 1858, they didn't register it. And because in 1858, they didn't register it, your grandparents were trespassers, so we take the land from you. It's an amazing system that I saw it in Australia and I saw it in South America in some places, how the state actually manages to dispossess the indigenous people, and this is what's happening in Israel. So you see, the two populations of the same size, Jews control about 90% of the area. That's all the land that has been Judaized or Israelized. The population there are about 50-50. And you can see all the stats there. Land policies, the area has been Judaized. And this is, of course, a great source of conflict. Because when people are dispossessed and marginalized, they try to resist. And they try to resist in various ways, politically, legally, and sometimes through violence. Because this is a violent process. The state doesn't come empty-handed. It comes with its whole apparatus of enforcement, of punishment, of evictions, etc., etc. So this is what's happening. How much more time do I have, Mariam?
You have 20.
20 more minutes? Oh, good. Okay. So this is why in some of my studies, and I'm proud to be the pioneer in an organization that I headed called B'Tselem, a human rights organization, which is a sister organization to Adalah that was already mentioned here, and to El-Haq, that we put a big report about 5 years ago about apartheid, and we compared it to South Africa. This was a taboo word in Israel. It's probably a taboo word to talk about Israel now in Europe because you'll be blamed to be anti-Semitic, but it is the truth, right? So I think that has to be happened. The management of space is very similar to what it was in South Africa. There is also a convention for apartheid. You can see the definition. There is the Rome Statute in 1992 that also defines it and finally accepted in 2002. And those kind of Bantustans where people, the black people of South Africa were concentrated and had some kind of autonomy are quite similar also in size to the areas that Palestinians are concentrated in the West Bank, in Gaza, and also inside Israel. Like Manal said, the citizens that have slightly higher rights are also very much in enclaves, altogether covering 15% of the land. and the Jewish parts cover 85% of the land. So this is where spatially we're saying, but this is not the end. It's continuing. Now in January this year, the government have decided to have 10,000 more settlers in the West Bank. Smotrich, who is the head of the settlers, and he's also the minister, the incredibly powerful positions now. The settlers are the Minister of the Finance and the Minister of Internal Security, and they have incredible leverage, and they're using it. So they're using it all the time. Usually when a European leader comes, maybe not Giorgia Meloni, because she's friends with Netanyahu, but when Borrell comes or Macron, then they build new settlements, or of course Biden, in spite of, and just recently, 2 weeks ago, there was the most amazing conference. You've seen this, Omar, in Jerusalem?
Dancing for
occupation. The dancing ministers, there were 12 ministers and 18 other Knesset parliament members dancing, and they have a map of Gaza cleansed from the Palestinians, and they have people that come there and said, we are ready to settle in Gaza. So the settlement push and pulse is, of course, primarily, it's very institutionalized. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of organizations, schools that educate people for that. Thankfully, the government hasn't approved it yet. It might not approve it, but it's definitely a possibility. So I wanted to sort of look at, I already talked to you about land. This is the foundation, if you like. Terra nullius is in Latin. It's a legal principle that existed since Roman times, that if the land belongs to nobody, you can have it. So this is how Israel is using it, where they prove, like I say, that even if you live on the land for 100 years or 200 years, and you didn't register it, it doesn't belong to anybody, right?
Although, according to the Ottoman rule, you could use the land for your interests. So the villagers didn't register it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a good social aspect. Open land, use it. So when the British came and you needed a certificate for it.
Yes.
Sorry.
The Europeans, they need everything to be registered, right?
And Israel used that.
So,
in Arabic, there is an expression that says,
El Ardesh.
Land is for people who cultivate it.
Yeah.
So if you cultivate it, it's yours. You stop cultivating it, it's not yours.
Yeah, so Israel has manipulated that, and this is the land of the refugee land in Israel. So in 1948, about 2/3 of the Palestinians become refugees, and immediately Israel enacted a law. By the way, it copy and paste word by word, kilma ad kilma, from Pakistan. I only found it in research with Sandy Kedar about 50 years later. But if you look at the Pakistan refugee, when the Pakistan pushed a lot of Indians into India in 1947, and Israel used that and confiscated all the land of the refugees. So you see that big part of Israel is actually Palestinian land, and this is a source of conflict very much. It has to be resolved. There is, of course, many dilemmas. It's not clear-cut because, as I said, most of the Jews came as refugees too. Serge de la Pergola, the most Zionist demographic expert, he said that 85 to 90% of Jews that came to Israel, they declared that they are Zionists, but really they had nowhere to go. They were refugees, right? So this is also a factor in trying to create some kind of social justice. And then in the West Bank, this is a new stage. This is not 1948. This is after 1967. You see the blue area has been declared state land. Also, I studied and written about it, a big report from B'Tselem. It's called Under the Guise of Legality, if you're interested. We really went for the first time into the court decision, into the logic, and it's total manipulation. But the court received it because the Palestinians were too weak to represent themselves properly in court. Sometimes they didn't even have representative. So when the Jews come and say, well, according to this Ottoman law and this British law, and the judge says, well, that sounds logical. So more than half the West Bank is now written as Israeli national land. Just makes it complicated also for peace. 10 more minutes. Okay, the other aspect is segregation. Manal already covered it quite well. Just some images to show how harsh the segregation is. This is the apartheid wall in the West Bank, Jerusalem. Some of the roads in the West Bank, for example, you have these signs quite often. This road is for Israelis only, you know, passage for Israelis only, prohibition of non-Israelis to pass. And then they also give a legal definition on the sign. While you drive, you can say whether it's legal or illegal. That a Jew, no, an Israeli would be considered to be an Israeli citizen or a Jew from anywhere else in the world. This is what it says on many, many signs. So again, this is part of foundation for the apartheid also on the roads. I did a comparison here of statistics about segregation. It's called the index of dissimilarity. Probably architects and geographers use it all the time. And here there's also a little bit of hope. First of all, Israeli cities are very highly segregated. These are the cities, not the kibbutzim and moshavim and villages. But you see a big difference between Beersehba and Haifa, okay? And Haifa is not highly segregated, much less than the other cities. There's a recent book that I recommend you. It's called The Haifa Republic. And it shows about the possibility of a binational existence that Haifa represents. My grandfather, my mother, and myself were born in Haifa. So there is a little bit of a personal issue of it, but also it represents a rare model in Israel-Palestine. But it is a possibility, and one of the hopes that we have is actually urbanism, because most of the countries is not very highly urbanized, most of the country is segregated. And you see the other countries around the world, cities around the world, Birmingham, St. Louis, Cape Town, where you have conflict, you have high segregation. Where you have lower segregation, you have lower conflict in general. So this is a problem, and this is Haifa. And up there is Nazareth. That is also has become a new mixed cities. Would you say Upper Nazareth is a new mixed cities? So urbanization has some process, despite what Manal showed, which is obviously very troubling in Afula. The city itself is more open and creates possibilities. Digitalization that I studied in the last 2 years actually presents, surprisingly in a way, because you know, when the digital world started to emerge in the 2010, the Arab Spring, we see it as a new democratic forum, open forum. Nobody is going to control us, etc. So very quickly, states take over. States and big corporations take over. So there is a Palestinian scholar that I really recommend to you. His name is Helga Tawil, and she writes about how the digital fields have been used to surveil and oppress the Palestinians. And she has this famous article called Digital Occupation. And also she has a wonderful philosophical article that's called Surveillance Sublime, which is kind of a panopticon sort of, you know that people are looking at you, but you don't know where from. Like it's some kind of a godly, this is in the West Bank and Gaza. And then, of course, inside Israel, there is more and more possibilities of surveilling Arab and Jewish citizens. So the whole spatial management has changed greatly with sensors, with cameras, with drones, with aerial photographs. And a lot of it is with planning too. Simplex, do they use it in Italy? Now, most local authorities in Israel started to use Simplex. Simplex is a 3D application that is combines drone photographs, aerial photographs, and street cameras, and it can trace any building infringements because it's 3D, it's not 2D. So if you actually have moved 2 bricks out of the line, it will pop up as red, and it's used intensively against the Arab population. It's also used against Jews, but much less, and especially against the Bedouin people that I work with. So this is another aspect of digitalization, which is very, very troublesome. We saw on October 7 that the digital power is also limited. When Palestinians, the Hamas, in very, very primitive element, you know, they just blew up the fence and just rode through it with motorbikes. So there is a limit to digital power, but nonetheless, it's something that is very important. And this exemplifies how digital power is creating ethnic conflict for the future generation. This is the map that is now Israel is laying optic fiber cables everywhere. This is a new stage in digitalization. It brings people ability to use G5, much faster internet, much greater data. And without getting to all the details here around Beersehba, I would say that the Jewish areas get it first. This is the government tenders for Bezek, for this company. The poor Jewish areas, the poor Jewish areas and the Arab areas get it second, some of them. And about 30% of the population, which is the Bedouins that live around here in the metropolitan area, don't get it at all. Okay, and they have to find their own way. They can get it if they fund it themselves. Okay, so this, you see how digitalization now is creating the gaps and inequalities and conflict of the next generation, because this is children for school. You cannot buy now even a bus ticket or a movie ticket without being online. So about 30% of the population here is totally excluded, about 25% included but on a lower level, and the 50%, top 50%. So this is one part of the study that we do now, and we do it also for Jerusalem, which is even worse in Jerusalem, and for Tel Aviv, which is better. So I'll skip that. Gray spacing, I think you already know quite a bit about, so I'll skip that. This is people I work closely with, and the idea here is that the planning system makes them neither fully included, neither legal, but they don't also evict them. They keep them in between the liminal space. There is hundreds of thousands of people like this in the West Bank and the Negev, and so they are displaceable. They're not approved by the plans, but they're not evicted from the plans. And this, for example, is one Bedouin neighborhood right near Beersehba. It's called Aser. I live very close to here. And you can see the existence, which is quite similar to indigenous people around the world elsewhere, right? So in that respect, gray spacing is really quite important. And want to spend the last 5 minutes on resistance. So resistance has various paths. There's also armed struggle and terror. And of course, October 7 is an example of that. I wrote an article about it, critical about it, called Boomerang Insurgency. And I compared it to other places around the world which attempted to have a terror campaign to get the rights, like the Tamils in Sri Lanka, the Chechens, the Kurds, and all of them fail miserably because they give the state, the oppressive state, they give them a reason to oppress the people further. And this is exactly what's happening in Gaza now. State crimes are justified by terror. And of course, Hamas, there is a big split among the Palestinians. Hamas is, since the 1990s, is using terror, and whereas most of the Palestinians support non-violent struggle. It has to be said, and the Palestinian Authority, as weak as it is preventing terror and violent uprising. But overall, I think in planning, in architecture, we have to look at other forms of resistance, which quite often around the world have become more effective for the longer term. The non-violent resistance is more effective because it's much more moral, and it's creating also a foundation for a democratic society in the future. So the Palestinian College Sumud, this is hanging on, not giving up, refusing, and then also building alternatives, exposing the apartheid system, and trying to find ways to decolonize.
We call it resistance by existence.
Resistance by existence. I'm sure Omar will elaborate on it.
That's why I commented.
Big part of it is the NGOs, that people actually take initiative on their own and start to use it. And big part of it is a global civil society. And here, Italy is important, Europe is important, the Arab world is important, as a global civil society has quite a bit of power. It has power to elect their leaders, it's elect power to, what's happening now, of course, in the United States is a civil society is pressuring Biden to stop funding this this incredible massacre in Gaza. If there wasn't American civil society, that would just continue, I suppose. So this is where I want to show two examples. Alternatives, right? How do we break out of this separate and unequal? The fact that space planning and of course other systems of law and violence have created this stratified citizenship. which Jews have full rights, Palestinian and Israel have partial rights, Palestinian territories have almost no rights, etc., etc. So one part of it is alternative planning. And I think this has become quite a tool. We did a big project for all the unrecognized gray spaces around Beersehba to actually get them to be approved. And this was about 10 years ago. It's a project that was 4 years. We had a group of 7 planners working on it. And we presented to all the planning committees, to the UN Habitat, to Brussels, to the courts, that we have a plan, that this kind of localities can be approved according to the planning principles. This is now also extended to the West Bank, to Area C, which is the periphery of the West Bank. There's hundreds of thousands of Palestinians also without approval there. So this is the alternative master plan for unrecognized Bedouin localities. There's a process with the people. It's really quite difficult. They hear the word planning, tachtit, and they run away. You have to convince them that planning is not against them because they suffer so much house demolitions and evictions. Eventually, we managed to do that and create with the people the plan how to actually design the space, which is currently chaotic, how to use the traditional indigenous system of land and property, like from the Ottoman times, to actually return it in a modern way, how these neighborhoods can actually be developed with infrastructure. And this is Atiyah El-Assem, who is the head of the group of about 150,000 Bedouins without rights. He said, after decades of fighting in the system, with endless committees, court cases, appeals, media, and politics, we've reached the conclusion that we must produce a professional alternative plan. While it didn't succeed in all its goals, that's an understatement. Of course, the state didn't come and say, oh, we adopt your plan, right? But it didn't succeed in that way. But it has been a game changer in our struggle against displacement by hostile states. And this is true. There's much less displacement now. And also it builds the communities. When you start talking about with the communities, sometimes a very large, 10,000, 15,000 people, they start thinking differently. They start thinking about the future. But of course, it's a struggle. But from 45 localities that were unrecognized, 11 were recognized since we started that. So it also has an impact on the professional and legal level. And the last point is the peace movement we created, that Omar is also part of it, that Bilad al-Jamia, land for all. And we are actually offering how the two nations, Palestinians and Jewish nation, can actually have the self-determination, have two states with open borders, with shared capital, and create a confederation, much like the incredible success of Europe. And people that come from Jewish history know what a disaster Europe was, a graveyard of the world. 70 million people in the 20th century were killed in Europe, right? And it's become the center of peace in the world. How? It's also planning, right? They started the cooperation of, what was it, the 6 countries in the beginning? And then it expanded, it opened the borders, it created joint institutions, first economic institution, then the European Commission, etc. And I think that's the approach that Israel-Palestine should go. To some extent, we look at Bosnia too, which was also a disaster area. And it created a type of confederation between the Croats, the Bosniaks, and the Serbs after a terrible war. So this is the way to go, because the country cannot be partitioned, but it cannot be united either. It has to find a way where the two nations would actually live together, being independent, but also sharing the land. So if you want more details, I have all the details there. And I want to finish with this kind of, it is a dire situation. We are quite desperate, but we hang on to, we clutch at the straws of some hope. And there are some hopes. And this was, can we play 1 or 2 minutes of it? Will it play? I ask you whether we have the audio. This is Mira Awad and Achinoam Nini. They actually wrote a song together about Jews and Palestinians. It's called a eunuch. It's called Your Eyes.